Good afternoon, everyone. An introduction to ethics. The purpose of this video is to provide a brief lecture and discussion about one of the readings that you have for this week. That's going to be pages 35 to 46 from the Republic. And I'll be providing a few other videos this week for the other readings that you have. The first thing I need to explain is why I've broken up the readings the way that I have, and why you're sort of beginning here with Plato. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the course, we're focusing on three normative theories. And the first of these normative theories is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics focuses on particular character traits that those who are considered virtuous exhibit on a regular basis. So when they um, engage in certain types of actions and make certain types of choices, what we see reflected in those actions and in those choices is a particular type of character trait. And that is going to be the way by which we evaluate actions according to virtue ethics. Does the person exhibit the appropriate character trait that we would expect of someone in a particular set of circumstances? That came up in last week's readings from the Sandel text regarding the U.S. commander who had to make the decision about what to do with the Afghan goat herders that he encountered. In one way, there was the Kantian way of thinking about it, which was killing is wrong. There's the utilitarian way of thinking about it, which is saving as many lives as possible. But we could also use the virtue ethics approach and ask whether or not the decision that the commander made was virtuous, which is to say courageous in this specific case. Did he exhibit the proper character traits associated with what we would expect of somebody who is courageous? Now, we're going to get into Aristotle next week, where the means by which we evaluate character becomes really clear in Aristotle, where he's going to have an extended discussion of specific kinds of virtues, individual virtues like courage and temperance and being even tempered. And we're going to get there next week. But usually, a discussion of Aristotle is incomplete without at least a small examination of Plato. And we're only spending this week on Plato. Plato, the entire Greek tradition is associated with virtue ethics. Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, all in their own way, defend a kind of virtue ethics. And a lot of it has to do with traditional Greek virtues that were associated with individuals in Athens at the time. And to an extent, that's what we get in today's reading from Plato's Republic. So Plato has a more roundabout way of making his points and making his arguments. He writes in dialogue form, telling more of a story, making philosophical arguments and points along the way through the character and the mouthpiece of Socrates. But teasing out the arguments is a bit more difficult sometimes than it will be for the things we read later. You're going to see how much different it is to read Aristotle than it is to read Plato quickly when we move into Aristotle for next week. But it's important to at least look at Plato, because Plato, of course, as the story goes, was Aristotle's teacher in Athens at the time. And so it's important to, just to get a brief look at what the arguments that Plato makes about virtues. One of the major differences between Plato and Aristotle is that Plato and Socrates argued the following: that if you have the right knowledge of virtue, In other words, if you know what being virtuous consists in, then the right actions will follow from that. And so there's no real gap between knowing what's good and doing what's good. And that if you fail to do what's good, it must mean that you lack knowledge. You can't, according to this way of thinking, you cannot have a knowledge of what is good and fail to have your actions follow. That is an argument that Socrates makes, and that in a way in this dialogue Plato is making as well. Aristotle will differ from that it is possible, according to Aristotle, to know the good but fail to do the good. Whereas for Socrates and Plato, to know what the right thing to do is must mean that your actions will follow. And if you do the wrong thing, you cannot possibly claim to know what the right thing is. You either don't have the knowledge or you are mistaken about what the knowledge is of what the right thing to do is. So that's the major difference between them, and that's why it's important to at least look at Plato in this context. Now, the text we're reading is a very large book titled The Republic. I'm only having you read, you can see, just how thick this book is, and this is the PDF that I had you, that I'm having you access for only this week. And I need to just say about what the Republic is. The Republic is a text that contains many, many, many philosophical questions embedded within it. But one of the primary question in uh, the Republic is the question, what is justice? Does justice have an essence or a nature that we can figure out through philosophical questioning and examination? So the entire book is aimed at trying to figure out what justice is. Justice takes on different, justice has different connotations. For the purposes of thinking about um, this class, justice is going to have different meanings. There's going to be legal justice, according to which justice means that we, uh, uh, follow the laws correctly, and those who don't are punished according. So there's legal justice. There's also moral justice, which means that you are acting in the right ways, irrespective of what the laws are. There is moral justice. There's also political justice, which has to do with the relationship between a government and its citizens. Now, what I'm going to be focusing on this context is moral justice, which is to say simply, it's about ethics. It's a it's about for the Greeks, they talk a lot about the concept of a soul. And for the Greeks, being just has to do with having the right order and proportion to your soul, to having the different parts of your soul do the things that they are supposed to do. And so justice for Plato in this context has to do with um, having a kind of balance and harmony to yourself, having the different parts of yourself be aligned with each other. And that will come up more in Wednesdays and Fridays reading. But I need to say a bit more about where you're starting today. You're starting with book 2 of the Republic, and of course, there needs to be some context given for where you're starting in this reading. You're picking up today where Socrates is continuing a conversation about what justice is with two individuals named Glaucon and Adeimantus. Immediately preceding the conversation that Socrates is about to begin with Glaucon and Adeimantus, he had been engaged in a long conversation in Book 1 with a character named Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is one of the most famous interlocutors that Plato includes in any of his dialogues because he poses such a formidable challenge to Socrates. Thrasymachus is convinced that he knows what justice is and that he will not sort of back off of this, even after Socrates characteristically shows why the definition that Thrasymachus has given of justice cannot possibly be what justice is. I'm not going to say that that comes up earlier in book one, but by the end of book one, what ends up happening is that Thrasymachus says the following. He says that the unjust individual, the person who engages in what we would just call bad actions or immoral actions, the person who engages in that type of behavior, let's say lying, cheating, and stealing, let's say that those are the primary things that the unjust or the bad person engages in. Thrasymachus makes the claim that the person that engages in that type of behavior is always living a better life than somebody who lives a just life, which is to say, somebody who is good. Thrasymachus wants to say that the person who lies, cheats, and steals, and is also able to get away with it, is always going to live a better life than the just person. And that's a really big claim because I think at least hopefully you and I regard being a good person as worth something. But yet, Thrasymachus wants to defend the claim that the unjust life is actually always better than the just life. Now, Socrates is able to, by the end of book one, show what is wrong with that kind of argument. He kind of dismantles it. Intellectually, he does so. But unfortunately, as book two picks up, Glaucon and Adeimantus remain unconvinced that the unjust or that the just life is actually worth something. In other words, that being a good person is actually worth something. They're not convinced by Socrates' argument against Thrasymachus. Now, Glaucon and Adeimantus don't agree with Thrasymachus. They think that living a just life is worth something, but Socrates hasn't convinced them. So, what they're going to do is to actually make the same case that Thrasymachus was attempting to make. Even though they don't buy the argument, they are going to argue for the supremacy or the superiority of the unjust life in Book 2. They're going to make a case against being a good person. And they want Socrates, after they have made this case against living a just life, to then show them why justice is worth anything at all. Because to this point, they don't think he has done so. And so the way that this is working is even though Glaucon and Adeimantus don't believe in the arguments they're making, they're going to make the arguments so that whatever case Socrates ends up making will be very strong because it will need to respond to the very strong case that Glaucon and Adeimantus have made against the just life. So they're acting as a kind of foil for Socrates. They're going to set up an argument against justice so that whatever case Socrates makes must be able to overcome the very strong arguments that Glaucon and Adeimantus has made. Because Glaucon and Adeimantus are much different than Thrasymachus. They are engaged, they are interested in the truth of the matter, which is to say they're not interested in simply making a rhetorical or a persuasive case in favor of injustice. They are actually interested in making a philosophical case against the just life. Whereas Thrasymachus, if you go back and look at book one and you're not required to read it, Thrasymachus is what is referred to as a sophist. He's kind of a politician. He says things very beautifully. He's more focused on the how of something, of what's said versus what's actually being said. And so if you just listen, you get kind of swept up in the beautiful speech that Thrasymachus is making. Even though he hasn't really made much of an argument, he said it so persuasively that you can't help but be persuaded. And Glaucon and Adeimantus are actually interested in truth, not persuasion, which is a fundamental difference. They're not interested in making a flowery speech. They're interested in truth. They want to know, is the just life better or is the unjust life better? Right? Because, as they say, this is no small thing. Right? This is a matter of how one should live their life. Right? And so this is a really big deal for um, this is a really big deal because we're not talking about some theoretical exercise. This is it better to be a bad person or is it better to be a good person? And that is a really, big deal if we're trying to figure out the answer to that question. Um, and so so Glaucon begins making the case against injustice. Glaucon is going to step up first. And Glaucon is going to he's going to have a story about what he's going to say, where does justice actually come from in the first place? And he says that justice is ends up being he wants to tell a story that justice is a kind of compromise. So if you look at the top of page if you look at the bottom of 36 and the top of 37, this is where Glaucon talks about the origin of justice. And he says that individuals, what happened was individuals realized that they wanted, there was this situation where, it was basically a war of all against everyone. There were no rules and no laws. And so these individuals in this condition, where there are no rules and no laws, realize that this is a very unsustainable condition. And so what they have to do is they have to make some laws so that they are able to punish transgressions. But yet they also still want to be able to get away with doing certain things. And so justice is this kind of unwilling compromise. They want to be able to continue engaging in the kinds of activities that they did when there were no laws, but yet that is unsustainable. So there has to be some way to punish individuals. And so justice emerges as a kind of social contract. And so he says, this then is the genesis and being of justice. It is a mean between what is best, doing injustice without paying the penalty, and what is worst, suffering injustice without being able to avenge oneself. So there he says it's a compromise. So doing injustice without paying the penalty, which is the best, which means you can do whatever you want and not have to worry about the consequences. And the worst, which is that you have to sort of suffer as a result of somebody else's actions, and you're not able to avenge those actions. And so there's got to be some way to be able to avenge it. And so it's a kind of compromise. We create these laws to be able to allow us to kind of continue doing bad things if we'd like to, but also having recourse. If somebody does a terrible thing to me, I am able to avenge them because I'm able to seek recourse through the law. And so the entire theme of Glaucon's speech is that justice emerges unnaturally here. It doesn't emerge naturally. It just has to, that our natural condition, what we like to be able to do, is to be able to lie and cheat and steal as much as we want. Unfortunately, lying and cheating and stealing, there are going to be victims of our lying and cheating and stealing, and those victims want to be able to have some way to avenge themselves. And so we create laws, and so justice ends up being sort of equivalent to the laws that we don't really like, but we have to follow. And so there's no inherent goodness to justice. It's something that we kind of have to come up with through the law as a way to help out with the untenable situation of there being total lawlessness. So that's the first part. The second thing that Glaucon is going to show, and he says this here on page 37, he says that even those who practice justice do so unwillingly. And that is a crucial argument, that the reason that individuals engage in any kind of good behavior is only unwillingly, because they are afraid of the consequences of doing bad things, so they do good things. But if they could do bad things and not get caught, they would do the bad things. And so that is the only reason somebody acts in a good way. Not intrinsically for its own sake, but simply because there is something, you are afraid of the consequences if you do bad things, and so you do good things. But that's the only reason. And that is the point of the Ring of Gyges. Because what Glaucon is going to say to Socrates is going to say, look, let's take two individuals and let's give them this Ring of Gyges that makes them invisible. Let's take a good person by nature, and a bad person by nature. And we're going to offer both of them, the good person and the bad person, this ring. And they both know that the ring makes them invisible. And Glaucon asks Socrates to imagine what he thinks each individual would do. And Glaucon thinks it's obvious that each individual would take the ring and do terrible things with it, regardless of whether they are a good person or a bad person. Because both the good person and the bad person would take the ring and do terrible things. So what Glaucon thinks this shows is that the only reason anyone does anything good, again, to go back to the first point, is that they are afraid of the consequences of not not doing good things. But there's nothing inherently good about being a good person, because if you come up and say to Joe, let's say that we have Joe who has a reputation for being the best person around, that he's a good friend and a good dad and all of these things, and he's the best person around. But then we say to Joe, but Joe, what if you could do really bad things and no one would ever find out and you could get away with it? Wouldn't you do that? And of course, Glaucon thinks the answer is obvious. So if it's the case that the really good person would also take the ring, then that must mean, if the best person around would take the ring, then there can't be anything intrinsically good about being just. At least that's what Glaucon thinks this must show. So that's the second step. So he's shown what the origin of justice is as a kind of social contract. And now he's shown also that anyone who does act justly only does so because they are afraid of the consequences of not doing so. Thirdly, Glaucon is going to present one more scenario to Socrates. And it's related to the same theme, and this appears on page at the bottom of 38 and 39. At the bottom of 38 and then on to page 39. So if you look on page 38, where Glaucon is saying, as to the judgment about the life of these two whom we are speaking, we'll be able to make it correctly if we set the most just man and the most unjust in opposition, right? It is as follows: we shall take away nothing from the injustice of the unjust man, nor from the justice of the just man, but we shall take each as perfect as in his own pursuit, right? And so what he's going to do is he's going to take he's going to set up a contrast. He's going to say, let's take the very best individual, and let's say that they are actually a just person. They are a good, just person. Let's take them and let's give them a reputation for being a really bad person, which is to say then that they are just, but they seem unjust. So being just and seeming unjust. Let's take that dichotomy. Being just and seeming unjust. And this language of seeming and being comes into play at the top of page 39. Now so we've got the actual just person who seems unjust, and then we've got the actual unjust person who seems just. So now we've got, so over here, remember? Over here, we've got being just and seeming unjust, and we've got being unjust but seeming just. And the question that that Glaucon asks is, what is actually going to be the better of these two combinations? Is it going to be the person who's actually a good person but has a reputation for being a bad person? Or is it going to be the person who's actually a bad person but has a reputation for being a good person? Well, Glaucon thinks the answer to this is obvious. It's going to be the person who gets to have the best of both worlds. Everybody thinks that, so it's going to be the person who's actually a bad person but seems like a good person, because the reason they seem like a good person, they get to have all the friends, everybody likes them, but behind the scenes, when nobody's around, they're actually committing all kinds of terrible things, and they really enjoy doing those things, but nobody knows that they're doing them because they have the reputation for being a good person. Whereas the other person, who is a good person, but no one knows that they're a good person because they have the reputation for being a bad person, why would you want to live that kind of life? Um, and often, what I tell students in this case is that the person who was good but seems bad is Socrates. Socrates, if you've ever read the Apology, had a reputation in Athens for being an unjust person. If you know the story, Socrates was sentenced to death by the city of Athens. So he had a reputation for being an unjust person because of going around and asking people all these questions. But yet, most or well, Socrates definitely regarded himself as a good person. And a lot of people who read Plato don't really seem to understand what the problem is with Socrates. So he actually is a good person, but seems like an unjust person. And of course, he's killed. And so we've got these other examples of individuals who are good but seem bad, whereas we have these other individuals who are bad but seem good, and that seems to be the best combination. And that so Glaucon now has made a lot of claims against the just life, and overall the point is that the, that justice has no intrinsic rewards. Justice is for suckers. It's not worth anything to actually be a good person. It's only worth something to seem like a good person and to have a good reputation. But when no one's looking, for example, when you have the ring of Gyges, so to speak, you do whatever the hell you want because you can get away with it. So why wouldn't you choose that life, right? Now there's more in the reading today from a guy named Adiamantus. I'm not going to go into his arguments as much. The homework questions largely deal with Glaucon, and I think I've covered most of that. I just want to give you a sense of where I'm leaving off here, so that you know what's going on when the reading picks up, because I'm skipping over a lot. The reading ends, today's reading ends on page 46, where Socrates listens to everything that Glaucon and Adiamantus have said. And he says, wow, you've really shown why it's not really worth much to be just. And I have to admit, I don't really know where to start defending justice to you, because you've said a lot that has really made me doubt and question whether being a good person is worth anything. But he says, I'm going to come up with a kind of strategy to try to help you understand why justice is worth something. But what I'm not going to be able to do is I'm not going to be able to show you what that's like at the individual level, right? I am not confident that at the individual level I can show you why I, Socrates, or you, Glaucon, should be good. But I do think there might be a way for you to see it if I can show you what justice looks like in some bigger thing. And of course, here he's saying on page 46, he says that that we can actually look to a city. And why does he do this? Well, Socrates is simply making this kind of argument that we call, for example, we say things like the United States is a just country. or Clemson is a just city. I mean, you don't speak like that ordinarily, but it makes more sense to say it in reference to countries. But you could say Clemson is a good town to live in. Okay, maybe you say that. And part of what we mean when we say something like Clemson is a good town to live in is we presumably mean that the people that inhabit Clemson are good. Otherwise, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to say that Clemson is a good place to live in if we didn't think that the people living in Clemson were good. So Socrates uses this logic to say basically, if I can figure out what it is about the structure of a city that makes it good, then I'll have some clues about what it's like for the individuals to be good. So if it's the case that just cities are inhabited by just people, then once I know what a just city is, then it will follow that I will also know something about what a just person is. And so in the following two readings for the rest of this week, you're first going to get Socrates to show you what the just city is. Then once he's shown you what the just city is, he's going to show you what the just soul is. And so this argument is known as the city soul analogy in Plato's Republic. That the just soul is a kind of mirror of the just city. The organization of the city will be mirrored in the soul of the individual. That is the basic premise for how Socrates is going to defend justice. But I want to just bring you back to the larger picture. I know there's a lot going on in this reading, but at the end of the day, keep in mind the way that he's going to set this up is he's going to talk about different virtues associated with different groups. There's going to be different virtues. And at the end of the day, that's what we're focused on, is that normative ethics is about evaluating actions and choices according to specific virtue and character traits. So what you're going to get in the rest of the readings is a discussion of virtues and what it looks like to be virtuous in specific ways, specifically what it's like to be courageous, what it's like to be courageous, what it's like to have wisdom, what it's like to be intelligent, basically. Intelligence as a virtue, courage as a virtue. And so we're going to have different virtues associated with different groups when we start setting up the city. That's going to come in the next two lectures. But I just wanted to say, again, just to bring this full picture, Socrates, the reason he's defining justice at the end of the day is because he wants to show that there is a reason it's worth something to be a good person. And that's what this entire class is about. Ethics asks a basic question. Why be moral? Why be moral? Why do it? Why not do bad things? Glaucon has given us lots and lots of reasons with the ring of Gyges and the distinction between seeming and being. Glaucon has given lots of reasons to be a bad person. And at the end of the day, that's the basic question of ethics. Why be moral? And so, in answering the question, what is justice? Socrates is providing his own answer to the question, why be moral? And that's what's going to come in the next two lectures.